Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing awesome out there today. Thank you for joining me for our lecture today. And the topic today is going to be creation, or creation, a light in the void. So this lecture is actually really building on the last lecture from 2 weeks ago, which is the Godhead. So this is a continuation of the Godhead lecture. You can definitely understand it and grasp it if you're not, if you haven't seen that one, but I would definitely recommend that you go and check that out because we are building on the concept of the Godhead. Okay. So we're going to define creation today from a spiritual scientific standpoint. So strip it right down to the bones, to the basic dynamics. And then we're going to examine all of the dynamics of creation that we strip down into spiritual principles and see those in various different creation myths. Okay, so we're going to look at it as just the nuts and bolts, and then we're going to go through and examine that in different cultures to see how they described it through story and metaphor and archetype. Okay, before we get into that portion, we're going to do some, I would say, comparing and contrasting postmodern ideas about creation. So our kind of modern materialist ideas of our beginnings and how human beings began and how the planet began. We're going to look at that. And then we're going to compare that with the occult science behind creation. And that's going to give us a really good idea as to, in some senses, how we've lost a lot of the spiritual perception and capacities that we used to have in earlier periods, actually. Then we're also going to get into basically, I would say, how the spiritual hierarchies are the direct image of creation, and that there is nothing in existence. There is no being. There is no plant. There's nothing that is alive. Dead. Time itself. Space itself. None of that is outside of the dynamic of the spiritual hierarchies. Okay, so when we talk about the spiritual hierarchies, okay, we are talking about everything in existence and existence itself. There's nothing outside of it. There's nothing beyond it. And the spiritual hierarchies, if anything, is a classification system for everything that's in the natural world or our three-dimensional material world, and everything in the subnatural world, and everything in the supernatural world or heavenly world. That is encompassed in the spiritual hierarchies. So everything in existence, okay? So let's take a look at what we learned last week with the Godhead lecture. Okay, so here is what we covered last week. This is the Godhead. Okay, so this is we covered the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and we looked at the Trinity in different cultures, but this is the esoteric Christian version of the Godhead. Okay, so there it is there. Now, this is a negative existence here. And everything stems forth from that Godhead, creating something that we can conceptualize that looks like this. Okay, so here is the spiritual hierarchies in, I would say, the Western side of the mysteries. So on the column on the left, you can see the traditional names of the angels. Okay, and you can see that man is part of that. Yes, man is actually an angel technically, or is in the hierarchy of angels, has sprung forth from the angels, okay? Then in the center, you can see the anthroposophical, or the spiritual scientific terms for the angels, which gives you a hint as to their nature, the quality that they emanate, or what they brought forth into the universe. And you'll notice that humanity at the bottom has all of the qualities of the angels of the top and is actually operating within the angels that are above us. Going further towards the right, you can see the Greek script for them. And then you can see the Dionysian names for the angels going back to Pseudo-Dionysius and the earlier period in which the hierarchies began to be revealed to the public. Okay, so you may want to take a screenshot of this just for your own records, or so that you can refer back to it in this lecture or other lectures as well. Okay, so all of those hierarchies, in which there are 4 hierarchies, and each hierarchy has 3, all of those are technically an emanation of the Godhead. And the Godhead is sort of like before existence, or the seed in which all existence stems forth. Okay? So we don't get individuality, we don't get sort of variation or anything until actually much later in the hierarchies, really. Okay? So what you saw there in the spiritual hierarchies this is the structure of the universe. This is the structure of the cosmos. That's what this is. And why this is the best structure that you can possibly have is because it is a human structure. So it's not some kind of extrapolation where somebody has created a mathematical equation or a mathematical principle and then projected and extrapolated it into a theoretical layer cake of dimensions and planes, which may or may not reflect the human being and the human creation at all. That layout of the hierarchies, of the spiritual hierarchies, is the evolution of humanity itself, the evolution of the cosmos itself, of the universe, of time, of space, of everything is in that structure. And it is a human structure, a structure of beingness and of life, rather than of mathematical equations and guesses, okay? So you can actually enter into that and it will reflect back to you. You'll actually be able to work with that. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's get into what is creation. So if we understand that the spiritual hierarchies is basically revealing to us creation as being beings within beings within beings, and being so great at a certain point that they are, the cosmos itself is one great being, right? What does creation actually mean? When we talk about creation, what are we referring to? Okay, on a fundamental level, well, we're referring to the creation of the cosmos, okay, the universe, planets, okay. We're referring to creation of the human being as well. So the creation of man in the cosmos. And as we're going to cover in this first part, we're also talking about the creation and existence and classification, precise classification of different kinds of spiritual beings, or beings that do not operate in the material world. So the spiritual hierarchies is also how the scheme is how we actually enter into understanding beings that are not of the earth and they're not of the material plane. Okay, so that's how we delineate that. Okay, so sometimes in different spiritual texts, you'll find that different people will talk about the world, the creation of the world. And what we've come to think that means over time is the earth. So the singular creation of the planet Earth and all life on it. But what's actually referred to when we talk about the world is the entire material plane and everything in it. So anything that a human being can touch and perceive with the 5 senses, that actually is what the world means. So the world is not just planet Earth. The world in creation science, or in spiritual science, talking about creation, means the entire Earth plane earth realm, which is matter, and matter is the 3D world. So all of that is united. So there's this incredible impulse right now in humanity to atomize things, to fragment things, and to sort of, I would say, misappropriate spiritual teachings and principles into materialist concepts that make the material plane and the lower astral world like where everything exists, if that makes sense. And it's not the case. So the world of man is not just the planet Earth, but it is the material plane. It is all matter. That's what the world means. So if someone is standing on the moon, or if someone's standing on Venus or Mars, they're not actually interacting with Venus. They're not actually interacting with Mars. They're not actually interacting with the moon, meaning you're not actually engaging with the spirit of the moon, where there is the natural world of that sphere. You're interacting with a symbol of Mars, a symbol of moon, a symbol of, you could say, Venus. And these spheres are actually realms. And so the spheres are not, and were never meant to be, the planet itself. It is a marker of a realm in which there are spiritual beings that exist, classically called angels, that live within that plane, that have an effect on humanity and that have interacted with humanity at various different times. Okay, and so that's how different realms work, is the sky of a certain plane will reflect other developments, but it's not another development, if that makes sense. So the Mars beings live in the Mars plane, right? And the Venus beings, or the angels that represent that sphere, live within that plane. They don't live on the planet. They're not from there. They're not rooted in that. This is the Earth's gateway to that. Does that make sense? So it's a rendering of that plane in our world. So there's a difference, because a lot of people will talk about how there's beings from this planet, from this star system, and they like exist in the material plane. No. And I understand that that's a controversial thing to say, but beings exist in the realm of their own, which is their natural world. And if there is interaction with beings from another world, that involves a spiritual process. Okay? Okay. So in this way, like when you look at the spiritual hierarchies, you'll see that life, so beings and life unfold on the vertical, not the horizontal. So life doesn't proliferate sort of like in really different individuations on the material plane. Everything in the material plane that's in the subnatural world, so an animal, a plant, a vegetable, an elemental, all of those are actually within the human being and stemmed from the human being, which the human being is the embodiment of the earth, and the earth is the embodiment of this plane. Okay? So life actually unfolds on a vertical. Okay, so when you get a hierarchy of angels that comes about, let's say the archangels, those are the natural beings within their realm. Okay, or the angels, those are the natural beings within their realm, if that makes sense. And from them stem another being. So from the archai stemmed the archangels. From the archangels, part of the matter of the archangels goes into creating the angels, and humanity is in the image also of beings in the higher hierarchy. So life actually evolves on a vertical with the essences and the actual, you could say, qualities of the angels being passed downward. So every time you move down, you get a different being that isn't in the image of the higher beings, but is incorporating a different quality. So this idea of a chaotic cosmos that we just can't understand where this being is from, or we don't understand what is going on this planet, that's total and complete materialism. And that ideology comes from essentially not understanding spiritual science. Not understanding the spiritual world at all. Just not factoring it in. Okay, so life comes about in a descending condition on the vertical, and everything horizontal proliferates from the natural being of that realm and is an aspect of it. Okay, so that's creation. Because there is an idea as well that there's all of these different planets that have life in these distant star systems, and they're visiting us, and they're coming here, and all this stuff is going on, and I'm willing to agree with that, and I'm willing to completely be open to that. But we have to also examine that, if that's the case, then where are they? Okay, where are they? And it's like any time that people want to provide evidence for aliens, they're always going back to a creation myth. They're going back to the Sumerian creation myth, or the Garden of Eden, or some creation myth, and then they reference angels. So they reference actual beings in the spiritual hierarchy that we can know and understand, and they call them aliens, and they create bizarre paradigms around it, usually involving technology, and they rewrite human history, saying that they're material beings and it's a materialist distortion. Because if there is a cosmos that's innumerably populated, our planet would operate very different, and we would have beings coming and going for thousands of years openly, because there's evidence the world is millions and millions of years old, going through different cycles of rising and falling. And so we have a lot of questions around the alien topic, and the alien topic tends to, more often than not, be referring to spiritual beings, so beings that exist in the astral world, and then calling them aliens. Okay, and then saying they're from this planet. Well, planet's a realm. So it's a misinterpretation in a lot of ways that leads to, you could say, sort of spiritual materialism, if that makes sense. And again, I reserve the right to, if somebody can walk out an alien and put it in front of me, or prove that an alien exists, and that it's not something that is chimerical and made in a lab, or it's not something from the earth in which we have the technology to do, I will totally believe that. I'm not against thinking about it. It's just that I have never seen evidence of it. So until that happens, because you have to go by, this is how it's been taught for thousands of years. And if you want to take away this teaching and replace it with a materialist ideology talking about aliens that exist in the material plane that are using spaceships and stuff, you're going to have to really prove that's not part of a prior civilization in Atlantis, a crypto-terrestrial, part of the government's desire to create an alien religion, and so on and so forth. Right? So I just want to say that, because it does seem to become more and more popular, this idea that even life is carried on through physical activities, that it's not an action of the cosmos itself, right? That we'll get into this a little bit later, but I just wanted to cover that a little bit. So life comes about on the vertical and is like a distillation of the form of life above it. Okay. All right. So, just to really hammer it home when it comes to interacting with beings that are from another world, how that happens is through spiritual means. So to us, those would be beings that are in the astral world. So that's going to be a higher astral being, which is like, would be an angel or various different kinds of extremely exalted figures, including human masters, angels, anyone in that hierarchy, right? Then there's entities that are in the lower astral plane, and those are divergent entities that have fallen out of, you could say, God's order or are working against it. Those are classically called demonic entities, but there's lots of different kinds of names or words for it. And that can all be observed in the spiritual hierarchies as well. So you can have elementals as well. A lot of people will encounter very strange and weird looking elementals, and they'll think that's like an alien or something weird, or sometimes they'll appear as orbs. Angels can appear as orbs as well. All kinds of beings. The first form they appear in is an orb, and then the form will proliferate after the orb appears. There's also deceased souls that can also be in the astral world, and all these different kinds and classes of demonic entities exist there as well. So even though we're looking at the spiritual hierarchies, that's just a basic outline of creation, and there's actually lots of sort of variation even within there when we're perceiving it. Okay. And really, there's no spiritual being that is excluded from the spiritual hierarchies. It's not like the spiritual hierarchies are just angels, and then nothing else fits into that except for angels. And then there's beings that are outside of the spiritual hierarchies. Everything fits into there because every rank in the hierarchy is not only a being, but a world. A realm. Okay, and every time there's a realm, there's one being that is like the embodiment of that realm. Okay, the embodiment of that world. Okay, does that make sense? So I'll also be going, after this lecture, I will be answering member questions at the end. So if you do have any questions that come up in regards to this lecture, you can sign up for my website, and then we're going to do a Q&A after this. I'll disappear from YouTube and I'll appear there. So keep that in mind. Okay. So basically, if we can understand creation, if we can understand how a realm or a solar system begins, or the cosmos begins, how the human being begins and evolves over time, we can understand basically any mystery. It all sort of boils down to whether we understand these dynamics. We can also grasp our distant past and our future as well, because creation happens in an orderly fashion, and evolution happens in an orderly fashion. And so once you get the basics, the dynamics, you can see how it proliferates, and you can track it, and you can track it in regards to your own consciousness. So understanding creation reveals your evolution. And it also allows you to place the different beings you may encounter in the spiritual world properly. Because when you understand creation, you understand what makes a demonic entity demonic. And you understand where in the cosmos they are, because you understand how the cosmos came to be, and the regions in the cosmos that contain these beings and why. And you also understand what a heavenly being is and how they came about and how we're an extension of them. So when we understand the spiritual hierarchies, we also understand how to place different beings that we encounter. And, you know, there's sort of this movement in the public to, you know, disclose alien life and disclose all of this stuff. And if we're looking at that with a materialist perspective, we'll never understand it, right? So it also helps us to not get caught up in these materialist delusions that lead us off track, that are basically leading us away from truly understanding our beginnings, right? Because that's the thing that I would say dark forces in the world want to hijack the most is our beginnings. Because if you can harness that, if you can harness the human origin story, if you can harness our beginnings, then you can control the future and what we are becoming. And you can lead people into a very, I would say, dark path, all by trying to control creation and the concept of the spiritual hierarchies, which illustrate creation. Because every being in the hierarchy is a different realm, is a different world, which we stemmed from, okay? So the term creation in spirituality refers to how both the cosmos, or the world, and the human being came to be. From this understanding, we can also grasp how humanity and the planet evolve. Through studying creation, we can ascertain details about our deep past and distant future. This is because the cycles that make up creation repeat, allowing us to examine very long eons of time that our lower mind is not prepared to comprehend. The word world in spiritual literature refers to the realm of the earth, or the entire material plane. The world is anything that we, the human being, can perceive with our five senses. In this way, the world is all material existence. It does not just refer to the planet Earth. As materialism and scientism has set in, it has caused us to hyper-focus on the material world and atomize it and project spiritual concepts into it that are not naturally present or real. Okay. In other words, while we are surrounded by the planets, we can only enter into the realm in which they have life or have beings in them on a spiritual level. This is done generally through astral experiences, the death process, or generally astral travel. So if you want to go to the realm of Mars or the realm of Venus or the realm of the moon, these different layers of the higher planes, you do that in your spiritual body. You do that in your astral body. And that is how you can encounter these beings. And there are very rare times where you could say the veil will thin and certain beings can appear. Certainly masters are like that and stuff like that have mastership over this plane. There are exceptions to it, but those are exceptions, not the rule. And you can't base a cosmology over an exception. So the world, or the realm of the earth, refers not to the planet Earth. It refers to all locations in which man can objectively perceive and physically reach. And why we have to start out really defining these things is because, you know, our ancestors, they weren't able to even imagine physically going to the moon or different planets. It wasn't even in their lexicon. Even 150 years ago, people weren't even sure that they were physical. A lot of people thought that they were all just plasma balls. And so now that we have this ability to potentially spread outward from the earth, we have to understand that whatever we are able to feel and perceive with our five senses is part of the earth realm. Okay? So there's no need to like atomize different planets and think that these have their own life that's different than our own, or whatever it is, because that's trying to make life which appears on the vertical, that's trying to make that horizontal. So the human being is the being of the material plane and of the earth realm, which is a completely radical concept today, but would not have been a radical concept even 150 years ago. And so with the rise of materialism, with the rise of scientism and technology, and the degeneration of the spiritual, I would say, capacities, we've come to form this sort of strange version of what the cosmos is, including misinterpreting a lot of spiritual texts, because we were just in such a different phase then. Okay. So all that is in the material plane is in fact the earth. It is matter. Okay, matter is mutter. It is mother. It is Mother Earth. All matter. Doesn't matter what planet it's on. Okay. To be clear, only beings of the earth, of matter, can fully operate in the material world. The earth and world of matter is the singular domain of the 10th hierarchy of angels, or man. It is in their image, and their image alone. Thus, all planets and stars are symbols of higher worlds that coexist with man in a different octave. So when we see Venus, that's a symbol of a higher plane, okay? Every planet is like that. Every star is like that. It's hinting to us about a higher world, which we used to call the heavens. The beings within these higher realms, these planetary realms, have classically been called angels. In the East, they were called devas, D-E-V-A-S, and especially they were called that when referring to heaven, but a lot of people would associate demonic beings and call them fallen angels as well. But that was what we used to call them. And why I use that language is because I want everyone to be able to study this on their own. And by changing the language, you prevent your students from really understanding the etymology and then being able to go back and study it properly. As I've mentioned before, the only way that language should be changed is if there's been a revelation on the concept. There's been no revelation here. So I don't see why the term should be changed to create this different stream or this different path, which tends to lead towards materialism. Everyone is free to create their own terms as they see fit, but when it comes to entering into them as a spiritual practice or connecting to the history of the word, which is very important, especially because you've had past lives in which you've used this language, you've used the word angel or ange or whatever it is. So there's a reason why we keep the language. It's an initiating word. So there's no need to strip words that are initiating words that have a history, because you're stripping them of the sort of legacy that leads you back to yourself. So to man, these realms are best understood as states or conditions of development. The spiritual hierarchies directly reveal the various degrees of life in the cosmos. So why, when you go into the astral world, you don't take your physical body is because the physical body has not yet been transubstantiated. Okay, so the condition is not prepared for the higher worlds. That only happens when the human being reaches the state of Atman, maybe Buddha consciousness. Then there is a freedom to move about. Okay, so in that way you can see the different delineations of the spiritual hierarchies, not just as realms or planes, that are full of beings, but you can also see them as conditions of consciousness that humanity will eventually attain or integrate within their being. And this is why I argue for this integrated system and scheme, is because it's meaningful. And they do represent different stages of your own initiation. There's no reason to remove that unless you don't want to have people connect with how they build their own immortal body, their own immortal self. So when we view the cosmos, we should be viewing it as a picture of our own spiritual evolution first. And we should be entering into those ideas first. And then once we understand the cosmos as human, an angel, and a living being, from that point we can create different interesting scientific extrapolations. You can do whatever you want. But once you reduce the cosmos into a number, into numbers, into something inhuman, into a simulation, and you operate in that too long, it's very difficult to train yourself back into seeing it as stages of initiation, as a living evolutionary system that we are operating within, because you've just reduced it to something that's a machine, in which those qualities cannot be present in that definition. So the cosmos has to be seen as a living being with different aspects of itself that are also beings in which we operate within. That's the way of it. That's how you would view it from a mystical, spiritual perspective and an evolutionary perspective. That's a primary way in which we should view it if we're concerned about our own initiation, our own evolution. So let's get into how creation is viewed in the world today. It is viewed very different than especially thousands of years ago. So I would say the mainstream idea of creation is basically a postmodern chaos theory. That's what it is. It's postmodern chaos theory. And it is missing the masculine principle. It is missing the father principle. It is missing the son principle. It is missing the God principle. And it is basically just an animalistic, chaotic idea. So we see today that basically life basically came to be, luckily, randomly, and I see these different scientists who are incredibly intellectually developed, but don't have a lot of spiritual understanding or spiritual perception, and they'll say things that are so crazy, like, we're so lucky that we came to be evolved on this little blue dot. And it's so random that human life even came to be. And you have Darwinism. And Darwinism came about, in the 19th century, caught on like wildfire with different scientists. And it still has people in a steel trap, thinking that the human being is nothing more than an animal. And imagine what that does to your consciousness. I mean, beyond it just being untrue, and we'll discuss today why it's untrue, it's incredibly demeaning. Like, if you were to devise a concept that you could hold about yourself that would be completely depressing and oppressive, that's what you would think about yourself. And also it also has the effect on the consciousness of absolving responsibility for things. There's no need to become moral, because if there really is no God, then there's no desire, there's no need to be moral, right? And that's where we get a lot of evil in the world. And so also there's that funny picture of how human beings came to be was we were once a fish, and then the fish You know, it sprouted these little legs from its fins like a tadpole, and then it crawled out of the water, and that continued, and then we got human beings. So, you know, when I look back at that, even modern evolutionary biologists and things like this that are fixed on it, it almost seems like a pathological need to explain creation in an exclusively materialist point of view. Like it's exhaustive, you know, how far it goes. So I don't know if any of you guys remember Piltdown Man. Piltdown Man. It sort of shows the intense desire that a lot of scientists had to explain creation as evolution, and that Darwinism and the idea of evolution is really more of a cult than I would say any religious cult. You know, here's a picture of Piltdown Man. Now, Piltdown Man was a human skull on the top, and a bunch of different British scientists who were Darwinian in their discipline decided that they were going to prove to the world that evolution was real. And a lot of this is sort of a disgust with religion as well. I do think that a lot of individuals are disgusted with dogmatic religion. And this is a way, on some level, for some people to get back at that or disprove that or disrupt that. Anyway, so these individuals, these scientists, actually ended up gluing together part of a baboon skull and a human skull. So the bottom part of the jaw was a monkey, a baboon, and the top part of the head was human. And there are pictures of it on the right there. And this is an image of them working towards that. And you can see Darwin behind there, peering over, probably elated. And so this was discovered to be a hoax. It was in different museums. It was sort of trotted around as though this is the great proof that what spiritual systems say about creation and all their strange myths, that's all childish superstition. And what we really are is basically just highly evolved animals, and this is the proof. However, people started looking at Piltdown Man and were like, sir, this is a baboon jaw on a human skull. And it was today it is a scar on the face of the Darwinists and of the evolutionists, because it showed that weird desperation to make this true that really doesn't have anything to do with science. Creating a hoax like that is a religious, dogmatic thing to do. Okay? That's not a normal scientific thing to do. Okay? This is what a cult does in order to gain adherence or serve its religious purposes in the world. And that's exactly what this is these individuals are in a scientific materialist cult in which they have stories about creation that are much more bizarre than some of the creation myths we're going to read, because they diminish the human being into a lower condition than is our birthright. Now, today we're seeing sort of like another sort of Piltdown Man hoax, which is that there's a problem with Darwinism. There's a problem with the idea that human beings have evolved from apes. It's not fully explained. It's just good guesses and estimations. And the problem is that there's this missing link, right? And it's never been fully satisfied. So the missing link in our time, and sort of the Piltdown hoax of our time, is that human beings were created by aliens. This is how, in the modern era, the evolutionists or that scientific materialist impulse is continuing. And you have people that are saying, well, you know, humanity was originally an ape. Okay, they were in the animal kingdom. And it is these aliens, these alien beings from Mars or from Aldebaran or Tau Ceti, it doesn't matter where, they just throw all these things up in the air to see which one sticks. But probably Mars, looking at things. And these aliens that are these alien sort of beings that go and colonize and see different worlds, they created humanity basically in a petri dish. There's several different versions of how human beings were created by these aliens. Again, there's often several different theories that float around and then some stick together. But this has been going on since Mormonism, in a way. Since the 50s, Van Tassel preached this, okay, in the 50s. And these different alienists have repeatedly taken spiritual texts that refer to angels and the proliferation of humanity in the direct image of angels, and they've turned it into something that doesn't even resemble creation at all, and that does not reflect our holiness at all. It takes away from it, right? And this is made worse because humanity has gone through periods where we've had incredibly advanced technology. During the Atlantean period, we developed spacecraft, we developed genetic modification, gene splicing. We had all of this before on our own planet. And so it's people's ignorance of Atlantis and the earlier epochs of our own planet that allows this idea to be outsourced as aliens, which hurts us. Because this idea of alienism is modern day Darwinism. It leads people astray into materialist concepts. So the reason why humanity has suddenly been raised from apes is because these aliens came to our planet, you know, in spaceships and took our and created all of these different humanoid forms and whatever. So now the blanket answer for everything is aliens. And it's not a sophisticated enough answer at all for what we've got going on, right? So the alien God ideology, as many of you know here, is like the new Darwinism. It's like the answer so that the impulse of Darwinism can continue. That's basically what it is. It is a chaotic version of humanity and a chaotic version of creation. It's a very postmodern idea where everything truly transcendental and spiritual has been stripped away, and you get this bizarre materialist monstrosity, and that's what we're looking at there. So our creation is trying to be, our idea of creation is slowly trying to be worked away by this harmonic materialist interest. Again, because if you can change somebody's idea of their beginnings, of their creation, then you can control them. Because the secrets of creation and the dynamics of it inform everything about this world. It's the structure of this world. Everything works in small recapitulations of creation. So we have to grasp it in order to confront a lot of the bizarre materialist postmodern ideas and spirituality that are going to confront us. So in our postmodern world, we are told that humanity has come about randomly, that we evolved from apes or we evolved by alien interference. We are told that humanity has no specific purpose other than to seek pleasure constantly or material success, that there is no evidence of the spiritual world or the soul. In this ideology, naturally man becomes the center of life, rather than God being the center of life. And this creates a sickness in the mind and body. And you'll notice this with a lot of the modern day New Age theories, is when you actually look at the mechanics of it, whether it be simulation theory or that the cosmos is a computer or whatever it may be, man becomes the center of creation. And it's not God anymore. Man becomes the point of all action and manifestation, and God is something that adheres to his mind, rather than us aligning our will with God's will and being part of a harmonic chain of existence in nature. The materialist perspective excludes the spiritual and therefore cannot understand neither the beginning of life nor the end of it. The vast majority of reality simply doesn't exist for the materialist, and they are left to weave delusional ideas about humanity and the cosmos to explain the mysteries of life around themselves. The materialist cannot understand creation as the process of creation stems from spiritual circumstances. So all creation of any being, of any world, began in a spiritual astral existence and materializes and then spiritualizes again. It's an arc like that. And so why so many people have a difficult time grasping creation is because it begins in a spiritual realm. And if you don't acknowledge the spiritual realm, learn about it, and train yourself to perceive it, then you're not going to understand creation. You're not going to understand very much about this life at all. And you'll try to create pictures of things based on what you do know, which may not be enough. Right? And so when you place yourself as God, you basically seek to control everything that you can conceive of. So the logical conclusion of sort of the Darwinian materialist mindset and all of that, and even alienism, it always leads to eugenics. It always leads to transhumanism. It always leads to technocracy. Have you noticed that? All of those things go hand in hand. Where because the human being doesn't actually understand the impulse of life in the cosmos, they try to become it. They try to be the eugenicists that control the kind of beings that come into this world in their own image. Okay, because all alien God creation stuff is eugenics. That's literally saying that humanity began with eugenics. And that's why so many people support it, is because they're in that impulse. There isn't an understanding that human beings are the result of spiritual forces directly, and that we have to work very hard to understand those forces within ourselves and within the world. And that's not going to come through control. That's going to come through surrender and humbleness. Okay? So all of this leads to social engineering programs rooted in dominance like transhumanism, technocracy, eugenics, the alien God religions. If man cannot recognize God in the world and bow to it and humble himself to God in front of God, he will still crave God, and thus tries to become God to fill the void. So even if you don't believe in God, okay, there's still going to be a desire within you to experience God, but it's going to come out in weird ways because your mind is not actually allowing you to understand what you're actually longing for. And so that's where you get these weird people that become control freaks and create all this weird stuff, technocracy, might is right. It's just not understanding God. And so when you don't understand that, and you don't have that spiritual perception to start perceiving God in the world, then you make yourself a God. And that's where things get really dangerous, right? And in the anthroposophical tradition, that would be called like the harmonic impulse, the harmonic delusion that people fall into. So let's get into what creation is. All of that is what creation is not. All of those things are different ideologies that we are going to have to confront if we want to preserve the opportunity to evolve properly in the world. Okay, so the spiritual science of creation, which is the truth, it is order, and it is life. So the sort of scientific version of creation is chaos theory. That's all that is. It is just chaos theory incarnate, right? When you actually understand it from a spiritual perspective, it's actually completely orderly, and it is basically like, if something looks like chaos, it's because there's some concepts we don't understand. But the cosmos and God is order, right? It is order, it is life, it is truth. So the first principle is that all creation begins in a very spiritual form, reaches a point of sort of peak density, and then rises from that form again. It's called involution and evolution. That is the basic structure of every being and every planet, and that can be observed. All right. So we have times of involving ourselves in matter, of involution, and we take on certain, you could say, qualities, and then we integrate them by evolving or ascending out of matter. Okay, and every planet has that as well. It's not just every person. You know, planets are also going through that. That's the macrocosm and the microcosm. So creation is also cyclical. It's orderly and it's cyclical. So this is where you get into the spiritual diagrams that show everything progressing in waves of 7, and why in numerology 7 is considered the number of life and creation, is because every sequence of creation happens in 7s. Okay, and so that's actually how orderly it is. There's 7 aeons, there's 7 epochs within those eons. Okay, there's 7 every time a human being has a major change in consciousness and form, it is every 7 years. So 0 to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, 21 to 28, so on and so forth. Those are actually considered distinct periods of metamorphosis. So there's actually cycles of 7 that all humanity and planets can be seen adhering to in our world. And on the largest scale of creation, we have sort of the beginning of solar systems, right? Entire solar systems are like a being, and they come to be, and they are expressing a life principle, right? And then they collapse, and they enter into a sleep, or they dissolve, and then another system comes up from the sun of that system. And that next solar system is an evolution of the one that fell or collapsed before it. And then that solar system will have life, and it'll go through its recapitulations, its cycles, its aeons, its manvantaras in the Eastern tradition, and it will collapse. And another solar system will come about. And that's actually what we live in. There were actually different solar systems that came and went before our own, and we live within them as a further recapitulation of them. So even the collapse of a star, even the collapse of our star, isn't really the death of it. It'll be reborn in a different condition, just how the human being will live its life. We live our life, and we'll go through all of our phases, and then we'll pass, and then we'll come again on our own spiritual journey of incarnation. And just like that, you have the sun, and the sun rises, reaches its peak at high noon, and then it begins its winter cycle, its death cycle, and sinks away, and then it comes back, and this happens again and again. And so everything in our existence, from the largest solar system or a star to a human being, to every animal, to every elemental, we all have life, and we are all going through the same cycles of creation in the way that it is for us. But it is the same force that we're operating in, with the same laws, which are not chaotic at all, but actually very precise. So our world, our cosmos, has come about through the direct creative efforts of God. We live in a divine cosmos of order and precise cycles. Man has materialized in the direct image of God and can be understood as precise sequences of development. So, for example, if you watched my lecture on NPCs, or soulless people, people that are, called soulless, in that lecture we talk about the different phases of consciousness on the planet, that the human being actually goes through distinct phases of development, from essentially being like just sentience and becoming more complex until we have the ability to become self-realized. And through self-realization, we become an individual. We individualize from the group. And then once we're individualized, we use the force of God within us, our I am presence, the Christ impulse within us, and we spiritualize our form out of matter. Okay, so just within that lecture, you can see all of these different principles of creation and life playing out. So in human evolution, the evolution of our consciousness, we're already seeing this distinct recapitulation within us in evolution. Okay, in occult science, humanity moves through motions of seven great creative cycles. And through understanding the cycles of creation, we understand ourselves and the world around us. As the world has come about from God, the world is not chaotic, but rather ordered. God is both life and order, and humanity only evolves when we understand our relationship with God. Okay, so just a reminder, if you're catching me now, if you have any questions, go ahead and sign up for my premium member site, because I'm going to be taking your questions after I lecture here on my private site. So I'm just going to be taking questions from members today. So if you have any questions or this interests you, then do go ahead and sign up now and get your question in. The form should be open at this point. And I do also have live Q&As every other week as well. So if you like this, another reason to sign up would be that I do tons of questions every other Sunday, and there's forums over there, and it's a really great time with really incredible mystics where all of these spiritual topics are explored. So let's return to the spiritual hierarchies for a moment and kind of track back and look at it, because we're now going to just cover and really nail down everything that is covered in the spiritual hierarchy. So everything that the spiritual hierarchies contain specifically. So within this image here is the existence of time and space itself. So time and space in which we operate in emerges from the Godhead, which is that triangle at the top. So our concept of time and space emerges from that top triangle. And the time and space that we operate in is like an emanation from there. Okay? And then in the first hierarchies, you can see really the creation of the universe and the creation of solar systems that came before our own in the first and second, and even partly the third hierarchy. Okay? And in this, you can also see that it represents the creation of suns, of planets, of all bodies. There's not a body in space, in existence, that is not represented here by the spiritual hierarchies. And this is why, when it comes to the archangels, why are archangels associated with planetary spheres? Why bother doing that? Because it's their life essence that becomes the governing essence of that sphere, right? And as you go higher up in the hierarchies, you're actually looking at beings that you could say are the form of even greater concepts in the cosmos. So everything that you can think of is actually an emanation of the spiritual hierarchies. And as you go higher and higher into the first hierarchy, like the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, what we're getting from that is just the emanation of basic principles and faculties, and the very beginning of the solar system that we have now. And then as you move down the hierarchy, things get more complex. So then when you get into the second hierarchy, you start getting the concepts of like movement and motion. And you start getting, when you get to the third hierarchy, you start getting more individuation. And then everything that exists within our cosmos that we can see is an emanation of the beings of the hierarchies above us. So every star is not random. That's a being, okay? That's telling us something about the spiritual world beyond the earth realm or the 3D realm. That's a reminder of heaven, okay? Every planet is actually a being. That's why when you look at the mysteries, that's how it was classically taught until modern times. The earth is Gaia. The earth is a being. Okay? Mars is a being. Venus is a being. Uranus is a being. It's an angel. It's a being within the spiritual hierarchies. And the solid body that we see is an emanation of that being. But that being is, just like us, a being in its own realm. And you can even kind of see it, especially as you get higher up in the hierarchies. We're kind of like within their mind. That's how you sort of view it. But it's a living being, except its tasks, its life is different than our own. Ours are more complex in many ways. And we're an extension of them. So everything that we see in these spiritual hierarchies, we're at the bottom there. You see the fourth hierarchy, which is where we are, man. We are incorporating every single principle of the hierarchies above us. That is our foundation. And this is why when you go into Eastern literature and you hear about Sunat Kumara and the angels from Venus and anthroposophy, the lords of Venus, the angels from Venus, the angels of Mercury, those aren't aliens, which alienists will tell you they are in spaceships or whatever. Those are beings from the spiritual hierarchy, archangels, that at a certain period in time are, you could say, sanctioned to transfer their qualities into us, because we are an evolution of them and the entire hierarchy. This is why creation is so important, and this is why you can't just say, oh yeah, humanity came about because an alien genetically modifies you. No, because if that's what you believe, you're not going to understand creation at all, and you're not going to understand evolution, because how human beings basically came to have, for example, the faculty of mind, was that it basically was bestowed upon humanity from angels. Every faculty we have was given to us by the higher hierarchies, and they developed it in their developmental periods. And as you can see, going into the fourth hierarchy, there are two future stages of the fourth hierarchy, of man. Man is like the archai of its hierarchy. And so man will pass down its qualities of freedom and love and everything that it has, that we have within our being. At the end of our world, our realm will dissolve, and we will pass down our qualities into yet another form, which is yet a further evolution. So, really intense and wild stuff, but this was left out of a lot of teachings in order to encourage the development of individuality. But a lot of earlier traditions actually understood this. So that's the layout. That's how the human being has the faculties that we have, the form that we have. It's that we're an extension of these incredible beings that are so awesome and so foundational for our existence that all we can perceive them as is a planet, or as a sun, or as the zodiac. And when we do get to a higher point in spiritual development, we begin to be able to perceive them more as what they are. But generally, when you hear about individuals perceiving these very high angels, they often will appear to you very symbolically. And it's your consciousness that kind of controls how they appear. Because in a sense, when you get very high up in the hierarchies, they're very difficult to perceive. I mean, they're appearing like a star, so, and the spiritual hierarchies are also, they're also portrayed as Jacob's ladder. When people start talking about Jacob's ladder, that is the spiritual hierarchies. And when you see ladders in occult literature, that is a reference to the spiritual hierarchies. The tree of life is also the spiritual hierarchies, but kind of broken down into activities of the hierarchies. And so the different mystery schools understood this and preserved this knowledge, and they understand this large scale concept of cosmic and human evolution. And it's time that this idea comes forward, which is why there's so many weird ideas around it, is because it's actually time that we begin to understand just who the angels are and just what our past was like with them. Okay? So exactly what our connection is with angels, fallen and not, and exactly how we came to be as an extension of the spiritual hierarchies, which some beings are so exalted we just see them as a planet or a star or whatever it is, or time itself. Okay? And that's our mistake. That's an egotistical mistake. Is it's like, well, if I can't perceive a being as having a similar consciousness to me, then I'll just make it whatever I want it to be, right? Instead of understanding, no, a planet is a being, okay? And the delineation of life, how it exists moving up and down in density. Okay. And even the planets, not only are they higher beings, actual beings, altogether the planets form the harmonic of the sun, which is the great being or the Christ. So there's the idea of like the bodhisattvas sitting around the Christ in anthroposophy, or the 12 knights around the round table. This is also all the planets surrounding the sun. So every spiritual system that we have is in the image of the hierarchies, of the spiritual hierarchies. Okay. So let's get into okay, yeah. So there's always something. So in other words, through understanding creation, we understand how people evolve. We also can see all the kingdoms of life properly because you have man who is operating in the natural world and is the being of the earth. It's the being of the earth realm. And then beneath man, you have the kind of subnatural kingdoms, which contain the spiritual essences of the animals, the plants, the minerals, and the elementals. And all of those beings, the animal consciousnesses, which are like a group soul, the plant consciousness, the mineral consciousness, the elemental consciousness beneath those, all of those consciousnesses perceive us like we would perceive angels. And they actually evolve through us. So it's the actions of humanity that evolve the animals and the plants and the mineral kingdom. It's actually part of our task to live in harmony with God and be holy, so that within our own being, within our own form, we evolve the kingdoms of life that are beneath us. And when a human being can do that, they transcend the material plane. They ascend off the earth. They build their mortal body or the resurrection body. So the liberation of human consciousness leads to the liberation and evolution of the consciousnesses beneath us. So the subnatural world, right? Those beings look to us as angels and archangels and archai. That's what we are to them. That's the power we have over them, especially in a spiritual way. So this is how life operates. It's not just that there's the natural world and the supernatural world full of all of these different classes of angels and realms in which the angels occupy. We have that beneath us as well. So this is why it's important to understand it's the evolution of life is visible in the spiritual hierarchies, including our responsibility to care for and understand and be the guardians and servants of the forms of life that are beneath us, that are not individuated yet, that actually follow and are part of the currents of our own mind, which the kingdoms beneath man are. So when we understand this, it becomes very difficult to be a cruel person, because you see how much your own evolution is connected to the evolution of everything else. It's this atomizing and creating a chaotic cosmos full of a bunch of... There's always this sentiment that I see, especially with the different times that the military will come out, or these different three-letter agents will come out, and they'll start talking about the NHI. We have these biologics and all these different things that they discovered, or that they have inside of their like little army bases or whatever it is. And the sentiment is always like, we don't know what this is. We do not know what this being is. We don't know how many of them are out there. And it's like they're using this concept as a way to seduce you, your interest, to reframe the cosmos in this weird way that is like, it's mysterious. There's no way you're going to know everything about the spirit, like everything, okay? The point is to not know everything. The mystery is very much present and will always be there. But the way that this alien thing is being promoted is like, There's no way we can understand how another planet operates, how life on another planet operates, what life is out there in the cosmos. We don't understand what this being is. And there's this weird fear-mongering around it, when I can absolutely tell you that that is a materialist perspective. And you can have any well-attuned mystic, for sure, look at any being, and they will tell you what it is. That's what mystics do. They work in the realm of spirit. They see beings all the time. And part of that perception is being able to see where an entity is rooted, what its core essence is resonating. This can be done. There's nothing that exists in the cosmos that a human being, as part of this intricate system, cannot use their own essence and their spiritual perception to ascertain. The idea that there's all these mysterious beings around us that are a threat or that we can't understand is ludicrous. It's not a real concept, and it only exists in the militaristic, materialistic world that the various administrations try to force upon us. There's no entity, there's no being that is truly mysterious. There's people on the planet, especially a lot of people can get impressions immediately as to whether something's good or bad. A lot of people have the most basic instincts of survival. But this concept that you can't understand the planet Mars, you can't understand life on the planet Mars, the life cycle of planet Mars, is also false. We can understand the life cycle on planet Mars. People were talking about that in different esoteric traditions, all the way back to the Eastern texts, the Eastern teachings, the Lords of Mars. And the cycle of life on Mars is connected to the cycle of life on the Earth intricately, soul-wise, spirit-wise. That exists in anthroposophy as well. There's no planet in the solar system, in the cosmos, that we cannot precisely relate back to our own existence and understand it. So this is ignorance or propaganda. This idea that we can't understand Mars, we can't understand these different, and a lot of people who are engaging this, they understand it. They've pored over those esoteric texts over and over again. And it's the rest of the public that is uninformed, quite frankly. There's nothing in existence that, if you develop your spiritual perception, and if you place God, Christ, within your heart center, there's nothing that you cannot ascertain or know if you need to know it. This is the power of the human being. And it's disturbing that the movements in society are painting the cosmos like this, that are removing the spiritual hierarchies, removing our connection to everything and everyone around us, which is the whole point of a lecture like this. The spiritual hierarchies teachings let us know at their core that we are all interconnected. Every human being, every plant, every insect, every angel, every star, every planet. And sometimes we just have to hear it, to remember it. And if we can remember it, we can learn it. And if we can learn it, we can develop the perception. And if we can develop the perception, we can evolve properly. So, there are no worlds, there are no planes, there's no planets, there's no beings that cannot be known through understanding this teaching. through developing spiritual perception, because everything is rooted eventually in the same point of creation. So this idea of a chaotic cosmos that we cannot know is a control mechanism that, whether it's purposeful or not, if you think that the cosmos is chaotic, you can't figure out what this entity is, and you can't figure out what this planet, what life on Mars was, what real life on another sphere pertains, then you're going to have an ideology that is chaotic, whether you realize it or not. And then someone is going to come into that and try to create the order for you. You have to be the point of order. And the God essence in you is that point. And that's the danger of dogmatic science, is scientists become gods, people become gods, because they're always defining reality for you. They're telling you what the planet is. They're telling you all this stuff. And there's a point when you're interacting with the world where you have to go by what you know to be true. And that's all you have to go by. And that's how you learn. Only a very small portion of like human data should be determined by experts, really. So much of our life is determined by experience, and our efforts should be put towards developing spiritual perception. And that is what becomes our true guide, especially in complex discussions that eventually have to become spiritual. Eventually we have to go there, right? Because again, that's where everything begins. Every solar system, every star, every human being, everything in existence was once a spiritual form that materializes for a relatively short period of time and individualizes and then returns to spirit. So eventually we have to go back to spirit, because our future is spirit, is astral, and our past is too. So the deeper you go, the less solid it is in both directions. And another thing too is that another thing that we learn from the spiritual hierarchies is that man actually cannot be separated from the earth. And I've already lectured on this in my Mars and Earth video, Mars and Earth History with the Angels. But I want to touch on it here too, is because the human being is the being of the earth, okay? The human being is the literal embodiment of the earth. So the earth, if the earth was a human, it would be us. Okay, so the human being is the embodiment of earth and sun, of sort of like the sun is the masculine principle and then the earth is the feminine principle. That's what we are. Okay, so there is no going off of the earth and like surviving on Mars or surviving on the moon or whatever it is. These are materialist delusions. We are literally the earth, and we evolve with the earth over time as an extension of it. And every creature and plant and animal and mineral is within us spiritually, as we are within the earth spiritually, and the higher hierarchy spiritually, and the sun spiritually. So another sick ideology is that, you know, we need to get off planet to survive. This is again a delusion, right? And I've talked about that quite a bit. So there is nothing in creation, whether it be as small as an insect or an elemental being, or as large as space and time itself. There's nothing that cannot be tracked and understood by observing the structure and activities of the spiritual hierarchies or of the angels. Everything in existence finds order in the life of the hierarchies. To not understand this principal teaching is to forfeit your status among the hierarchies, among the angels. Man is part of the spiritual hierarchies, and it is his destiny to raise this ladder And to not accept that is to not accept our divinity. It is to deny our divinity. So we don't understand creation, we don't understand who we are, what we are, and how we evolve, we deny our own divinity. We deny our place among the angels as an extension of them. So that's the gesture that we do when we don't acknowledge this stuff. We make a gesture against ourselves. It's a self-destructive gesture to believe these different chaotic, sick beliefs. The creation and evolution of the planet, it is the life and essence of the beings within the spiritual hierarchies, whose individuality and existence is a higher degree of life than our own. While we may struggle to understand how a spiritual entity can manifest as a planet in our realm, the answers to this riddle lie within man's own abbreviations in the world around him, his own presence in the people and places he frequents, how man lives in the heart of those he adores. Adoration and love is the reason and purpose behind all life, and is the secret to the manifestations of the spiritual hierarchies in our world as seemingly inanimate things. So love and adoration is the mechanism of life. It's why the spiritual hierarchies exist and why they do what they do. And it's also love and all of the iterations of love within the human being that evolve the forms of life that are beneath us and within us. And love is the ultimate essence of the Father. What we see as inanimate, such as a planet, a meteor, a tree, a drop of water, a mineral, brims with life in a world just behind your mind, in the world of spirit itself. All of that appears dead. All that appears dead lives in spirit, and all that is spirit will experience death as it is born in our world, in the lower world. This is the secret of the hierarchies, and the secret even to your life. As you too, in this world of death, are spiritual beings who will return to the hierarchy once your own life completes. Your movement through Moon, Mercury, Venus, that's how your soul moves through heaven. It's moving through these different realms. And within these different realms are beings, specific beings with specific qualities. And that's why Edgar Cayce says the solar system is a school. We experience lives on different spheres, but the spheres are really entire realms, right? And we take on these different qualities, and we come back around and we incarnate in the densest sphere as a consolidation life to hopefully free ourselves of the need to do it anymore, which is the secret of eternal life and the immortal body and resurrection. Thus, this teaching is the revelation of your own self and the mystery of your own being beyond the limitations of this world. And that's the funny thing, is that, you know, we all experience the spiritual world, you know, and angels and the beings of the spiritual hierarchies. When we dream, when we go to sleep, we're literally in that world, okay? And we're connecting with angels, with beings, deceased relatives, masters, saints. We are released into that world when we sleep, and also when we pass away, we return to that world. So it's funny because we're in this period of human development where the incredible impulse is to totally cut ourselves off from the place and the beings that are more home to us than anything could ever feel here. And that's the danger of what we've been speaking about today. The more negative components about what we're speaking about today is that the spiritual world, the different realms of heaven, the different beings within them, are in many ways more real and eternal than this world. And that's why in the Eastern tradition, they used to call it Maya, illusion. It's because they understood that. That doesn't mean that you don't seek full embodiment and that you don't honor this world and our duties in it. But it is something that we have to remember in a culture that tries to turn that on its head and invert it and say that there is no spiritual world at all, or that, human beings aren't spiritual. It's a joke. It's a mental illness. Because if you don't have God as part of your lexicon, you're not going to understand anything in life, right? So now that we've covered sort of really getting into fleshing out the spiritual hierarchies chart, it's interesting to look at as a chart, but we really had to say there's nothing in existence that's beyond this, from time and space to planet to insect to elemental. Everything exists within the system. In this image of the spiritual hierarchy, it is shown as beings because you're a being. But you can look beyond that and you can see that also these beings manifest as spheres, as stars, right? And then even the beings in the lower kingdom are manifesting as aspects of the earth, right? So let's get into now the teachings of creation itself, or the spiritual science of creation. Let's break it down. So if we can understand the singular core process of creation, which I've called a light in the void, we can take that and we can understand its recapitulations as the world becomes more and more complex and as the beings in the hierarchies become more and more complex. So this is the basic foundational dynamic that repeats, moving downward, increasing in density and complexity. Remember, life evolves not on the horizontal technically. Life finds its evolution downward on the vertical. So you have one form, it completes its entire cycle, that gives way. Another world comes to be beneath that, more complex than that. Another being comes about, another solar system, that goes away, right? And then another one comes to be, another being comes, and it so on and so forth. This is the mechanism of creation that exists on the level of the cosmos and everything, and also within every single creature, human and otherwise, as you'll see. So typically, when you look at the primal elements of creation, there are three different impulses. There is the father impulse, the mother impulse, and the son impulse. Okay, that's typically how we're going to look at creation today. That's typically how it is portrayed. And I want to highlight that even though I'm using the word father, mother, son, or child, I'm not talking about human beings who are male and female. The reason why we call something father, son, is because it's referring to the male principle, which we refer to as a gender. But this is actually before, technically, these impulses existed, before human beings even came to really be, if you were to view it in a linear way. So these are impulses, not people. And you really can't apply the concepts of modern gender directly to this, because in occult science, when you're seeing something being called male or female, that's referring to the positive charge, which is male, and the negative charge, that is female. Because you can't start extrapolating that into people, because people are significantly more complex with that. So the female is negatively charged. It's a cathode. Okay, it's considered magnetic. The male impulse, the father impulse, is considered electric. It's considered the positive impulse. So that's what male and female means here. We're not talking about people being male and female. We're talking about the positive charge and the negative charge. That's the foundation of existence, and everything in creation comes about through the intermingling of the father and the mother impulse. Okay? So how it goes is that the father impulse, the ray of the father, penetrates the substrate of the mother, producing a son or producing a child. Okay? And the son is like and I'm saying son because pretty much in all creation myths, including Eastern creation myths, it's referred to as a male. So it's a god, I mean. So the son that is produced is basically like a new world, a new kingdom. Okay? And it is the new world that's come to be. So you can kind of view the feminine impulse here is kind of like the primordial matter substrate that's undifferentiated and chaotic because it's everything in existence. And then the father is everything in spirit. So the mother is sort of like everything in what would be considered matter. The father is like everything in spirit, is complete. The son, therefore, again, is the embodiment of the new stage of creation, you know, in the idea of the angel or the human. You're looking at basically the new Adam of that world. So the reason why in the Bible everything starts with Adam is because that's the Son, that's also Jesus, that's also Christ, that's also the Word. And that's the world. Okay? So it's also the newest hierarchy of angels, the newest stage of creation, the new world. And also you can also observe that whenever the Son is produced, whenever the new world is produced, a new element comes about. We're not going to get too much into that because that's going to derail us, but you know, even looking at the hierarchies, we have 4 elements on the planet. We have earth, air, water, and fire. So you can look at, hypothetically, you can look at the earlier worlds as being in the sort of less dense elements. So fire, air, water, and then finally the element of earth comes about. Matter comes about. Matter is earth. Earth is matter. Okay, that's how it's classically observed. So in a sense, we're in the 4th world. And that is the case when you look at the spiritual hierarchies. You can see we're in the 4th hierarchy. So the 3rd hierarchy can be associated at times with water, the 2nd hierarchy with air, the 1st hierarchy with fire. That may not, you know, seraphim literally means fire. Seraph means flame. So that's one way that you can kind of overlay, is you can understand it as we kind of see the spiritual hierarchies in that way. They have been reduced to an elemental force, but that, me just leaving it there, is incomplete. I'm just trying to open your mind and apply something like the elements to the hierarchies to get us thinking about them and starting to operate considering them, okay? So there's been lots of symbology for this creational principle. So the Father basically raise itself into the mother, and that produces the son. Okay, very simple. We all understand that. So how does the father symbology look in the creation of the world? Well, obviously, when it comes to the creation of the world, that's not like human reproduction, but human reproduction is a mirror of this principle, right? So how it's portrayed in creation and in the occult is that the father is obviously sometimes portrayed as like a ray of light. The father is portrayed as electricity, or in theosophy, the forces of the father are called fahat. And the father's also associated with air and the idea of breath and the idea of wind, and anything to do with air or breath or wind is sound. Okay, like we're going to go over the Hindu creation myth, and it's about the sound, the word that penetrates the waters. That's the father penetrating the mother. Okay. So here's some imagery that often appears like in occult stories, myths. It'll appear in occult rituals. Here you have a ray of light there on the left. This would be a symbol of the father. Pure spiritual force raining down, pure complete spiritual force raining down. Then you have obviously a sword or a dagger. This is also a ritual symbol of the father, the male principle. You have a lightning bolt or fahat there, the electrical charge. That is a very precise symbol of the father. Think about Zeus, who's the father of all gods, who is the sky god, the god of gods, and his lightning bolt. And Zeus goes around and impregnates people with it through parthenogenesis and stuff like that. You know, these are early creation myths that are describing the light and the void. The father is the sword, the electricity, the light ray. The obelisk is obviously very phallic. This is part of, in a way, it can be part of sex magic, obviously, but it doesn't even have to be sex magic. It's really just using the dynamics of creation, often in occult rites, to create balance and set a tone or open a portal or whatever it may be. But these are the basic dynamics and symbols of creation through the father. So again, any kind of phallic imagery is father. Like sometimes you'll see these different, like they have it, I think, in Ireland, these different places, and they have basically just phalluses. Like it's just penis worship. That's not worshiping like the human penis. That's worshiping the father and the generative powers of the father. That's what that's supposed to represent. Okay, just like the obelisk, just like the wand, the magical wand, you know, the staff, the uprightness of the spine, humanity becoming upright. Okay, these are all imagery of the father within the world, the effect of the father, and the masculine principle within humanity makes it upright. The feminine principle is more horizontal, which is the X, right? So the father principle is also the positive charge, the positive impulse. It's the initiating factor in creation, or the fertilizing factor. The fertilizing factor is the initiating factor, the factor that raises, that makes straight, that makes upright. That's the male principle. That's the father principle. Okay? It's also, while it's doing that, it's also creating order. Uprightness is also order, while chaos and horizontalness is the feminine. Okay? And if you understand that principle, you'll understand why the myths about Lilith are not about what people think they are. but it's that Lilith is trying to be upright. Okay, so when you understand that the masculine should be the upright, and then the feminine should be the horizontal. That makes the cross, that makes the X. That is the mystery principle. Okay? Again, this isn't about males and females. This isn't about gender at all. We seem to get really stuck on that. These are principles that exist within every human being. Every human being has a male aspect. Every human being has a female aspect. So let's get into the symbology of the mother. So the female principle or the negative principle is usually symbolized in creation myths as waters, as dark waters. And that's like the principle of undifferentiated matter. And it's very meaningful because the world before our own, the world before the earth came to be, the world of matter came to be as we know it, was a world that we would describe as liquid, as water. And that in anthroposophy is called the moon development. So the moon development is a water development. The sun development is an air development. And the Saturn development is a warmth or fire element, right? So we can even see in the genesis of our planet, it's really in alchemy and in the occult, it's the hardening of water to earth. It's the densifying of a liquid existence to a earthly existence. To literally matter is called earth in alchemy and in occult science. So the imagery is often therefore undifferentiated liquid, partially symbolizing the world that came to be and everything that was carried over in it, that is about to be transformed into another element, into our world, which is denser. And so in that way, the feminine principle is portrayed as water, as sometimes it's churning chaotic water, right? To show the end of the world, the end of the old world that came before our own, right? And so the feminine is also depicted as a void, as a dark void, as almost the abyss. That's also a symbol for the feminine quality. The feminine is the negative principle. It is like a cathode. It is receptive. It receives the father, and the father brings order and fertilization and structure to the chaotic and the abyss aspect of the feminine here. The imagery in the occult is sometimes just direct symbols of a yoni, but it can also be a chalice. It can be a cave or like an earthwork, like when you're going into an earthwork. If you think like the different earthworks in North America or in Europe, that idea of going deep into the earth, deep underground, these are feminine cults, or cults that recognize the power of the feminine, okay, the connective, incredible power of the feminine. Also a pool or well, you know, in England and the UK, there are things called holy wells, and they have statues of Mary around them, and there's a whole secret around those. And those are also part of understanding the feminine aspect of God. So pools, wells, caves, the chalice. Also, you'll find it in the Eastern tradition, the sort of primordial feminine substance is called mula prakriti. Mula prakriti. And that's how it's sort of described in the creation of the world, is the mula prakriti is like the feminine body, the feminine substrate that is everything. And then it receives the ray, the electrical force of the Father, creating a new element, a new being, a new life, and a new world. Okay, that's the imagery. And at times, like in the Babylonian creation myths, they also talk about like the primordial ooze that all beings stem from. That's also, the primordial ooze is also a representative of the abyss waters, the waters of the abyss. And so these are all metaphors for probably clairvoyant visions that people had about creation. So, in this way, you have this concept of a light in the void, which is part of the topic of today's lecture. So, you have a void, and then you have a light in the void. And that's how you could even perhaps clairvoyantly see the beginning, right? It's also, again, like electricity striking water. That's a symbol. As a concept, it is like creating order out of chaos, because when you're creating life, it's like a new order. It's like a new being, right? And another symbol of creation, of this father principle and mother principle especially, is the use of air. So if it's not fire or light in the void, if it's not talking about creating light and darkness, usually there is talk of air. So it is Brahma, or the sky god, that breathes into the void, that breathes into the abyss, right? It's breathing into the mother. And that breath can be the word, because the word is air. How we speak is through air in our throat being compressed. So yes, you have the primordial waters, which is darkness, chaos, the abyss. This is the feminine. Again, it's not women, right? It's the feminine principle. And the modern way that we can sort of like see creation is parthenogenesis. So this idea that some creatures still can reproduce through parthenogenesis, and arguably human women were also able to do that up to a certain point, also shows that there is some kind of spiritual internal process of fertilization, some kind of fertilization that's not external that's going on, some kind of reproductive impulse that is from within. And that can be an interesting study into creation as well, which is parthenogenesis. So now that we understand the masculine father impulse and all of the symbols that typically represent the father, all of the symbols that represent the mother, and the dynamics of creation on a simple level, let's get into several different creation myths from around the world. And we'll get into this, and then I will summarize what we've covered today briefly. And then I will disappear from here, and I'm going to go and take your questions on my members only platform. So again, if you have any questions or you want to support my work, do consider becoming a member. And I'd love to see you there. Okay. So we'll start with Genesis. It's a story that everybody probably knows. And now, as I read these, see how many things, see how many words and points adhere to the occult symbology that we just talked about and the dynamics we just talked about. So this is Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. So here is an image of Genesis. Different creators have portrayed. You can see in the first image, it almost looks like a beehive, which I think has a lot of occult meaning. And then you can see the elements there as well. And you can see the idea of the void and the waters. And you can see also like a black sun sort of abyss imagery in the center image there. And then of course, William Blake painting almost like the lightning, the energy of the Father being cast down to create the world. Okay, and here's the image for the mother archetype as well. So you have a cave or one of those holy wells on the side there. You have dark water. You have a chalice, and then you have a cave. So though these are the archetypes of the mother, this is where you would see the feminine principle in worship, in ritual. There it is. So let's move on to the Buddhist ideology of creation. So Buddha didn't really adhere to like one point of creation like we and other cultures have. You know, for Buddha, it was more like cycles within cycles within cycles. And there were many worlds, many lokas, many kingdoms of life, very, very much in line with the idea of spiritual hierarchies, but he didn't really get to the point of describing creation in the way that some of the other traditions did. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to use the theosophical sort of translation of Buddhist texts and how the Theosophists described it, simply because the vast majority of knowledge of the Eastern systems, which are written in another language, we get that from the Theosophists. So if it weren't for Blavatsky and all of the different Theosophists of the 1800s and 1900s, I don't even know if the West would have any Eastern teachings at all. There's most of that legwork of bringing the Eastern teachings to the West and translating them and bringing them forward was the efforts of the Theosophical Society, and they deserve the credit for that. You know, there's some outliers of people who were translating things, but, you know, in my knowledge, not to the level that the Theosophical Society brought it forward. So I'm going to be using the Theosophical explanation here of the Tibetan and Eastern sort of teaching of creation. And what they basically said was that this presence that's called the Fohat or Fohat, which is like this primordial electricity, which is the father impulse, flows into undifferentiated primal matter, creating basically what they described as bubbles or plasma orbs of new life. The cosmic electrical stream of the Fohat creates these bubbles in primal matter, which become the spiritual seed of all life. So they're kind of like how it's described is that all those little bubbles are like souls or the I ams. They're all kind of like identical, they're all spark. And that's how the beginning of time and life is seen. So it's interesting. It's kind of like there's this lightning that strikes the primordial matter, which creates these bubbles or these orbs, okay? And these orbs go on to form planet, and then from the planet emerges life. But the orbs are made out of the very substrate of the Father. And that's how you also get the reality that the human being is the embodiment of the planet, right? So, or of the cosmos itself, because on a very high level, we're already worlds within worlds within worlds at our stage of development and our stage of differentiation. I know that's a huge concept, but creation is a huge concept, but it's also something that we have to grasp. So another way is that it can also be called the Devi Prakriti, the Devi or Divi Prakriti, which is like the divine light force, pierces the Mula Prakriti, which is the primal matter. So the primal light of the Father pierces the primal matter of the Mother, creating bubbles of life. The mingling of these two forces is sometimes called Father-Mother, or it's a glyph that's called Father-Mother. And this goes into extensive details in a book, which is actually part of the Secret Doctrine, if you're interested, called The Stanzas of Dzan, or Dzan. And this is included in the Secret Doctrine, but you can also get the stanzas separately. And Manly P. Hall thought very highly of Blavatsky, very highly of Theosophy, and he actually went ahead and taught the stanzas. And I have a picture of Manly P. Hall's lecture on the stanzas here. You can take a screenshot of that. You can type that in search, and you can find that in the Manly P. Hall archive. And so if you find the Secret Doctrine difficult, and the Secret Doctrine also describes creation and angels and the spiritual hierarchies. But if you find that difficult, the stanzas difficult, you can go through Manly P. Hall, who also does a good job in breaking down the stanzas. And by the way, the stanzas of Dzan, how she apparently got that information was that she had access to these ancient Tibetan books on all sorts of things that outsiders were not allowed to be around. And so Blavatsky spent a large portion of her life touring the Himalayas, a large portion of her time in India, in Tibet, and she had access through the mystery schools to all of these different texts. And her task was to bring these Eastern concepts to the West, because the West had sort of developed to the point where it was beginning to destroy certain spiritual concepts through science and through dogmatism and materialism. And so how we would come to having a spiritual scientific outlook is to be able to view all of this holistically again, which doesn't threaten any religion at all, because there's an objective reality to spirit that is the seed of every religion in existence, right? So that was sort of her task. Anyone can debate onto whether that was successful or not or whatever, but at the end of the day, the stanzas of Dzan are a fascinating, interesting text on creation. Manly P. Hall lectured on them, and so if you're looking for that extra little bit, you can check those out as well. Okay, then there is the classical Hindu creation. There's a couple different versions of Hindu creationism, depending on what text you're reading. But I feel like this is probably the most commonly one taught. And it is very similar to Genesis and very similar to basically every other creation myth if you break it down to its components, which is that in the beginning there is nothing. There is just the void. And sometimes that's portrayed as endless ocean or these kind of dark primordial waters. And resting upon these primordial waters is the god Vishnu. And Vishnu is there sleeping. He's there dreaming. You'll see this a lot. And it's a very beautiful part of earlier creation myths, because they understood that within the spiritual hierarchies, how we actually understand that is that the higher angels are sleeping and we are in their dream, or we're in their mind. That's one way in which the spiritual hierarchies has been classically portrayed in stories. And so you definitely see this in the Hindu creation myth, where Vishnu is sleeping, and he's sleeping on the waters, and he's very still, he's waiting. This is a metaphor also for pralaya, because how different traditions would describe when a world came to an end, was that it went to sleep. And it would sleep for a certain time period, and all of life, all of that matter, no matter what element it was in, what form it was in, it would dissolve into a primordial substance of undifferentiated matter. That's called the abyss. And that's represented as sleeping. That's a pralaya. And it rests and it rests. And it does its own work that we don't understand. But everything is in there, good, evil, everything is in there, and it's chaotic, right? And then there is the impulse of the Father, and life begins again. And Vishnu wakes up. Okay, so here Vishnu is sleeping upon the waters. And slowly, a sound, and remember, sound is the word. Sound is, in creation myths, is very similar to in Genesis when they talk about the word. The word creates the world. That's also what air means, okay? And so as Vishnu is sleeping on the waters, he hears this sound gathering up and building up. And this primordial sound is Om. That's what Vishnu feels. That's what he experiences. Okay. And so the sound and the wind churn up the waters. They churn up the primordial matter. They disturb that primordial matter. And then the result of that stirring is that from Vishnu's belly, from his center of power, from his belly button, stems a lotus. And in that lotus is Brahma, is the god Brahma. And it's a 3-petaled lotus. And that lotus becomes Brahma's boat. So this is now, you now have, something is created, right? You now have this new creation. And in that moment, he knew he was to create the world. Brahma's creating the world. And so Brahma raises his arms and he divides his lotus boat into 3 parts. First heaven, then the earth, and then the sky. And you'll see this in creation myths, other creation myths as well. They reveal that the substrate of the world, which is united at first in a primordial existence of everything at once, like the Godhead, is then split into the heavens, which is a realm of its own, which is the supernatural kingdom of life, the higher hierarchies, the natural world, which is the earth, right? We talked about why the world is the earth. And then there is the subnatural world, which is sometimes called sky. So there was a difference many times between heaven and the sky, or heaven, and in Greece it's called the underworld. And so part of creation is basically dividing up the worlds, so to speak. And that's heaven, the supernatural world, earth, which is the world where humanity is going to become to be, or the natural world, and then the subnatural world. And that is in a lot of, it's in the Sumerian creation myth as well. The three worlds. It's in a lot of Native American creation myths where there's the 3 worlds. There's earth, heaven, and then there's the underworld, which is like the world in between heaven and earth, which is why it's sometimes called sky. But then it's also sometimes represented as under the earth as well, depending on the emphasis in that tradition. So you can see there's, you know, in the Bible, they talk about the firmament. The firmament is separating, is a membrane basically, or it's separating the earth and heaven, right? There's firmaments that separate the 3 worlds. And you can also see it in occult science kind of as like different directions of energy. And because these different worlds can be seen as different directions that can meet at a point, at a right angle point to create space, that's what also generates the firmament, is it's not so much a membrane, but the reality that these are different directions, and there has to be a space or a membrane that is like a chaotic point where the two directions are going different ways. Does that make sense? So the planes can also be seen in the occult as different directions, right? Different directions. And if you have two different directions, or different, not directions as in like a 3D sense, but different impulses, and when they meet each other, there's going to be a membrane there because they're different. They're going in a different direction. Okay, so here is the Sumerian creation myth. And the Sumerian creation myth is actually very sketchy. It's very shaky because it is so old, and also because we really only have fragments of the tablets. So we don't really have a lot of complete tablets available to the public, unless they're like hidden away somewhere, which I wouldn't doubt. But what we do know about the creation myth of the Sumerians is it's very similar. And basically, in the beginning of the world, there is this primordial sea, right? The primordial chaotic waters of the abyss. And this is represented by the goddess Namu. Namu, and also Tiamat too. And she is also seen as the god of chaos as well, because anything, the feminine tends to represent this world and all forces of the past, right? So all that is in the lowest, not least existence, but the most material level of the heavens all gather into what you could call primordial matter, the primordial matter of the world coming into being. That's why everything is an evolution, is because it's like the same primordial matter that is being recycled, and every time it gets more complex when every world is destroyed and comes back, or dissolves and comes back to life. The primordial ooze gets more and more complex, which people used to call these complexities chaos, right? Because the whole point of life is to essentially understand all of these complexities and place them rightly within our being. So the primordial sea is represented as Namu or Tiamat, and I have an image of her here. There she is. These are her different portrayals. And she gives birth to gods. One god that she gives birth to is the earth, or the earthly realm. And this god is called Ki, Ki, or sometimes Enki, right? This is Enki. And the other is heaven, or An, A-N. So two gods is the god the god Enki, or Ki, which is the world of the earth, the world, and then also to heaven, which is An. And then also at times in the Sumerian tradition, you also have Enlil, which is sort of very similar to the idea in the Greek tradition of the Hades. So here again, you have this idea that when creation happens, there's three planes of existence, three basic planes of existence. There's the supernatural world, the natural world, and the subnatural world. And our experience of that is as heaven, earth, and the underworld. That's our experience, personal experience of it. And then you have these gods that represent those worlds. Because remember, when we understand the spiritual hierarchies, how worlds were portrayed was as beings, how entire concepts were portrayed was as beings, how planets were portrayed was as beings. It's only very recently that we have not used the spiritual hierarchies to describe our existence. Okay? So in that way, you have the Hindu creation myth, which is like Vishnu and Brahma bring about the heaven, earth, and the sky. And then you also have very similar, in Sumerian creation, which is you have the goddess Tiamat or Namu, or this perpetual abyss of chaos, and from her stems, heaven, or the god An, Enki, which is the earth, and then also sometimes Enlil is seen as being the waters or being the underworld. Okay. And when you look at the three planes, that's like how you begin to look at it. Because if you also look at classical esoteric scripts, once you enter into the underworld, there's many different qualities or planes within the underworld that are also going in their own direction or have their own quality that you have to pass through. And that's why people think there's so many different dimensions and stuff, is because the underworld and the heavens are mirrors of one another, and they have different degrees of cohesion relative to the human being. So the human being experiences these realms as different layers based on the qualities they have represented in their own being. These are the gates in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and the different sort of lokas in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where in the underworld you move through certain lokas. That's still all the underworld. Okay, that's still all the sky or the underworld or Hades. Even though there's different, you could say, gates or different qualities that the human being has to move through, which make it feel like different planes. The same thing with heaven. There's different qualities to the heavenly plane that the human being has to slowly pass through that makes it seem like different dimensions, but really they're actually different qualities that the human being has to integrate through what's called spiritual initiation. And when the immortal body is developed, or the stage of Atman, then you can pass through all of those levels, and it's like one thing, you can go anywhere. So the experience of the spiritual planes, because we're imperfect, seems like different things, but really from the higher perspective, you could argue there's really only three worlds: the earth, the underworld. The underworld is a transition of the earth to heaven. It's the unzipping of the human being. It's the membrane between earth and heaven. It's the process of unraveling the earthly life to heaven. So it is a etheric, or it is an unzipping plane. So you can describe it as planes, but you can't get too carried away with this idea of all these different dimensions and all of these different planes, because even those are basically experiential gates more so than actual physical places. Does that make sense? So here is the Hindu creation myth. We'll go back to that for a second. This is obviously the larger picture. You can see this is the snake that Vishnu is sleeping in. And there's the lotus that appears from his belly button and brings forth Brahma. And then you also have Shiva there, the idea of the Fahat, or the Holy Spirit, or Chitta. And there's other really amazing images of Vishnu and Brahma. And there she is in a feminine form. There's a feminine form there. And then you can see all the bubbles. in the middle picture on the right, you can see Vishnu there. He's dreaming, and he's creating a cosmos with one hand. And all those little bubbles are from when the Fahat, the divine electric ray of the Father, was cast into the abyss of the primordial waters, creating all these bubbles, right? These bubbles are sometimes portrayed as different worlds, souls. They're the I ams. They're the I ams of humanity. That's just a really beautiful creation myth. Okay, so we're going to get into the Egyptian creation myths, and we're going to do two. So the first creation myth is in the beginning, there was just darkness, just a void, chaotic water. And this is represented as nu or none. And this is the abyss. And from these waters, a blue lotus emerges. And within this blue lotus is the sun god, Nefertum. And as this blue lotus rises from the waters, you can see that it has these bright yellow stamens that are bright and ray out like the sun. And so the blue lotus in Egypt is considered to be the symbol of the sun god, okay, because of the rays of the bright yellow stamens in the lotus. And the lotus in this way also symbolized the solar disk. Okay, so the blue lotus is also a solar image of the solar disk. And the light of the sun, or it's like the ray of the Father. If there's any kind of like golden egg or solar disk, this is like the ray of the Father, light. It represents light and electricity or light, and that is the Father's presence. So here, the lightning of the sun in the void is the source of life. And here is an image of the gods from that legend. And so the blue imagery is, I believe, that is nu or none. And I really noticed in a lot of the Egyptian and mythological imagery, the skin is like blue, or it's black or dark blue, and that symbolizes often the abyss or the feminine principle. Even if it's a male god, it'll be a male active principle that is expressing a feminine principle, which does happen, like Jehovah or some of the forces. Moon god, I mean. The moon god is like that. And so there's the blue lotus as well at the bottom. And you can see it has its yellow center, which is an image of the sun, which they believed was an image of the sun. And then the gentleman with the lotus growing out of his head, that is the symbol of creation in Egypt. And that is Nefertum. This is the individual that rose out of the primordial waters from the blue lotus. Okay, the second image of creation we have is that in the beginning there was the waters of the abyss, or Nu. And from the waters this time emerges the holy cow, which is sometimes Hathor or Mehet Weret. And between her horns, just like was between the lotus, is the great solar disk. And so this great holy cow, which represents obviously Taurus and the Pleiades, rises out of the abyss carrying the sun and gives birth to all life. The light of Ra within the waters of the sacred cow creates our world. So again, lightning in the void, light in the void. Matter or earth emerges from the alchemical mixing of the sun god, or light within the waters of the abyss. So actually the world comes to be, matter comes to be, through the mingling of the holy cow Hathor and Ra, which is the sun. Okay, here's an image of the holy cow. There's many different words for her depending on how you approach the ritual or the spell or whatever it would be. But this is Mehet Weret, or Hathor, sometimes Isis. Okay. And this is the last creation myth, which is the Hopi creation myth. And the Hopi creation myth I always found to be really fascinating because there's really not much like it. It's not just Hopi, it's also Pueblo and Navajo. So it's that whole southwestern region of the states. And according to their mythology, in the beginning of the world, there are basically two beings. There is what they call the spider woman or the spider grandmother, and there's the sun god Tawa or Dawa. And the sun god basically brings forth from his being all creatures in the world and the entire world itself. So Tawa, the sun god, basically thinks or dreams the world into existence. This is very much like how in the Trinity the Father projects forth the Son or the world. The idea of having a God dreaming a world is just a metaphor for the fact that the Father produces the Son in his direct image. The same thing with Vishnu. It's the mystery of the Trinity. You know, in the Hindu tradition, you have Vishnu, which in this case is almost like the father figure. From him, as a direct emanation, is Brahma. So again, we're seeing the mystery of the Trinity here, where you have the Father principle directly emanating in his exact image another being or a world. This is the mystery of the Trinity that we began with. It's direct emanation, right? And so this is very much present in the Native American creation story, even though they would have had no access to the teachings of the Trinity directly. Yet here they echo it. Here they say that the sun god, the Father, Tawa, creates in his direct image through his own mind the world, right? The Logos. And the sun god, sort of, once he's created all in existence through his mind, through his imagination, to connect all beings in existence, Grandmother Spider has her holy silk and she weaves every being together, connecting them. And so it is sort of like Grandmother Spider is the connective tissue of all things, of all beings. And that's very much the sort of deeper secret of the feminine consciousness too, is that it's the feminine essence that is enveloping, that binds all things, right? And so Grandmother Spider reveals that deep mystery concept by the reality that through her silk she weaves all people and all things and all in existence together on the spiritual plane. So I think that's a very beautiful imagery as well. So let's close it out here for today. Creation has been classically portrayed in nearly all cultures as the union of the sun or light and primordial waters, as light piercing the void or the abyss. Parallel to this is the concept of sound or the word resonating forth all life from the waters. The waters of undifferentiated primal matter. Creation is also seen as bringing forth order out of chaos. That's part of creation. Part of death is to take order and slowly dissolve it into chaos, whereas life is to bring order in this sense. In our modern era, parthenogenesis bears some scientific evidence of the spiritual dynamics of creation, of very early creation. So let's return and close this out by looking at the spiritual hierarchies again. Now, obviously, again, we're looking at different kinds of beings, right? But these beings are also worlds. And every being that you see here is a realm of its own, a world of its own. That's how we can see that. And even the higher hierarchies, we can't actually really understand those realms, because at that point, we would have to access that knowledge through the hierarchy above us. Okay? So creation begins at the Godhead there, the very top, where it says Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's where everything begins. And it pours itself forward and creates the first hierarchy, the seraphim, and then cherubim, and then thrones. And then the second hierarchy, the dominions, the mights, the virtues. The third hierarchy, the archai, the archangels, the angels. And then finally, the fourth emanation of the Godhead, the fourth hierarchy, is man. Okay, so this is the structure of creation as beings. That's what we're being shown here with this very mystical image. And the core phenomenon of creation happens within every world as its driving mechanism and becomes elaborate, obviously, in its iterations. And just looking at this again, we can just reiterate that life and all creation happens on the vertical, right? So every new being gives way eventually, its substance, its mind, everything, to another being, which takes on all of that and evolves it and then passes that off to another. So all beings exist here in a chain, and that chain is called the angelic hierarchy. And, you know, if they want to say in the Bible, here's Gabriel, Gabriel's part of Mary's Annunciation. We want to talk about the seraphim who gather around the throne of God, chanting, holy, holy, holy. We want to talk about the cherubim, the angels that Ezekiel sees. We want to talk about all these different kinds of angels that are mentioned in the Bible, or the devas that are mentioned in the Eastern tradition. Deva is the word for angel in the Eastern traditions. Every tradition has their word. In the West, we say angel. They're talked about all the time. The Greek gods. When people talk about the Greek gods, these are angels. The clash of the Titans is the battle in heaven. Is when you read about the battle of heaven in the Bible, which goes on all the time through these different light and dark forces in the spiritual world, that's the clash of the Titans. These are angels. And they're referred to all the time. They're referred to in the Bible, in Eastern traditions, and in every tradition. And now, to move forward spiritually, we have to begin to classify the spiritual world. We have to begin to understand its order. Okay, we know that the seraphim exist. We know that the principalities exist. We know that the Elohim exist. Okay, the 7 Elohim. Now we have to be able to understand more about how they correlate to one another and to humanity. Okay, these are things that we have to begin to grasp. And it's not polytheism, it's not pantheism, it's not God worship, it's not creating idols. When you study angels and you realize that the entire world is spiritual beings, including matter itself, you're not worshiping an angel by recognizing its class and function. You're just placing things in the construct in which they already exist, right? So sometimes Christian people can get very weirded out by this teaching because they like everything where it is in the Bible. But the Bible is not meant to be a spiritually scientific document that describes the spiritual world exactly. It's a series of stories and myths to prepare human consciousness for teachings like this, which is spiritual science. We have to be able to, in our era, be able to view the spiritual world with the kind of precision that we view the natural world. The natural world we understand through science to a point where it's driven us crazy. And we keep atomizing it and breaking it down and fragmenting, looking for more and more discovery, when the reality is we got to turn on the perception and start looking up. And we need to begin to develop the perception and build the knowledge of the spiritual world so that we can be able to look at the spiritual planes and spiritual beings with a sense of understanding. Just how we can view the different phylums of animals and their anatomy and their existence and all of that kind of stuff. All of the earth will really only make sense and come into harmony when we get to the spiritual level of understanding anyway. So that's why this is important, is because it's required of us in our age to take responsibility, acknowledge the spiritual world, and stop trying to make it what we want it to be. This is what it mainly is. We make the spiritual world whatever we want it to be, rather than really challenging ourselves, studying, and building up our spiritual perception through healing and whatever it may be, to actually be able to look upon it. But this is what's actually required for our age. Okay, so thank you guys so much for joining me. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you everyone for contributing today and for the support. I really appreciate that. And I'm now going to disappear from here on YouTube and Rumble and Instagram and Facebook, and I'm going to go on to my private platform and take your questions. So if you're going to head over there with me, I will see you there.